Poetry Vlog. Today we have Patrick as our guest interlocutor. Patrick is an incredible poet and scholar here in Seattle. Patrick, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Poet and scholar. So I'm finishing. I'm a
slash scholar.
Poet slash scholar.
Poet hyphen scholar.
Poet scholar. I think it's all one word. It could be scholar poet, but let's hope not.
Yeah, that's the nightmare, right?
So like Chelsea mentioned, poet slash scholar. I'm finishing up my dissertation, finishing up my PhD at the University of Washington. My specialization there is 20th century poetry, but I do a lot of work with poetry's relationship to other arts, especially music. So a lot of my work is word and music studies, a lot of libretto studies, and a lot of opera. But UW is also where I did my MFA in creative writing in poetry. So I spent 2 years there doing the workshop grind. And at the end of those 2 years...
It's like its own dance move.
The workshop bump and grind, right? And after all the bumping and the grinding, after those 2 years, I threw out all of those poems and just immediately started writing the kind of poem that I had realized I was supposed to have been writing all along.
Yeah.
So I adored my MFA. I had a wonderful time. It made me the poet I am, but it did not make the poems that I write. So
that's a good way of putting it, actually. It made me the poet that I am, but it did not make the poems that I write.
Yeah, and that was it was almost like as soon as I walked across the stage and took my little diploma, I suddenly realized...
Ours were empty.
Yeah,
we got empty folders.
You're always duped.
This is a metaphor.
Right. Yes. This is the MFA in creative writing. This is what it'll do for you. But it was like as soon as I had the letters MFA after my name, it's like, oh, that was none of that was what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
So
can you explain a little more, we'll start with the critical then, right? Like, what about it was what you didn't want to do? You know what I mean? Because I have an idea of what you do now.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that. But yeah.
I think the workshop environment, I refer to them as sort of like sterile conditions.
Yes.
Because you're in this...
It's literally on my website.
Yeah, you're in this laboratory that's sealed off from the rest of the world. And so the world never comes into your work, and your work never goes out into the world. Yeah. All it does is circulate for this like small group of people who will really give you the same feedback.
Over and over.
Exactly,
you learn more about your workshoppers than your poems.
You do. And you develop like a couple really intensely close friendships, and you develop a level of trust with like one or two people, but then you also develop like intense distrust with everyone else. And there is something to be said for cranking out a new poem every single week, that kind of pressure, because you run out of ideas after week 4 of your MFA, but you have not only like another 48 weeks to go, you have another year at the end of those 48 weeks. So
I didn't run out of ideas. I ran out of ideas that I realized would fly in my workshop.
Yeah.
So it was like I had an explosion of ideas, and none of them would work in that condition.
Yeah,
and I was like, oh no. I started hearing all of the things that my cohort would say about the poems, and it started making me like anxious to bring them to the table.
Yeah.
Or know if I did that I'd end up feeling kind of garbagey afterward.
Sure.
Yeah.
I will say though that like the best thing to come out of workshop, and I didn't realize how much it was the best thing until well after the fact, was I was in a workshop where every week we gave each other prompts. This is the kind of poem you have to write for next week.
Like the students gave each other prompts? I like that.
It was cool because, at that point, this is the second quarter, so we're all out of ideas.
Yep.
We need something to get us started. And a poet named Sarah Galvin said, your task for next week is to imitate a poet that you feel you could never imitate. And at this point, I had really just started, and I'm writing these poems that all like have deep thoughts, and they all are like setting out to like teach you something about the world. I'm like, here is my insight. Like, you're a little bit better of a person now that you've read my poem.
Here's my grain of wisdom to give you because I'm a poet.
Yeah, and like my favorite poem at the time was Larry Levis's Elegy for Poe with the Sound of a Carnival inside of it.
That was your favorite poem?
Yeah, it's an astounding poem still.
To be clear, Patrick's much more into the classics than I am.
No, I very love this. Okay, anyway.
Yeah.
That the poem ends, like, about 2/3 of the way through it. He says, and therefore, and then, like, goes on and, like, gives you the therefore of the first 2/3 of the poem. And I thought, like, oh, that's the kind of poem I want to write. But anyway, Sarah is like...
This, actually, now that I read your poems.
Exactly. Yeah. Sarah goes, okay, imitate a poem that you don't think can be imitated.
Yeah.
And so I picked up Tender Buttons.
Which is the opposite.
Yeah. And I was like...
I'm going to pause you for context for our viewers. Tender Buttons is written by a poet named Gertrude Stein, who is sort of a high modernist. Am I getting my lit arguments wrong?
No, I think you could say high modernist.
But she was a super cool gay lady in France that basically did experimental poetry, or what was considered experimental at the time. That was very, like, sound-driven.
Yeah.
So there was no message
Yeah.
that was hitting you hard, if that makes sense. Usually you left the poem being like, I have no idea what that was about, but I experienced something.
Tender Buttons broken up into 3 sections, food, things, and rooms. And each poem in these sections is essentially like a cubist painting of a piece of food or a thing or a room. And so you end up like you get the planes and the surfaces of the object, but you never see the object, and you really never understand really much of anything. Yeah. It's absolutely impenetrable.
So you decided to try to be Gertrude Stein, which is the opposite of like a therefore. Now you know.
Stein would never write and therefore. At least she would never write therefore. She would just say the word therefore maybe like 5 or 6 times until it stops having any meaning at all. Yeah. And so anyway, that's the kind of poem I set out to write. So I set out to write a poem about a rug. Yeah. And I will not be reading that poem to you today. It's not good, but it was my first honest attempt at like expanding my aesthetic and writing a different kind of poem. And it turned out to be the most powerful moment of my MFA because it was the first time I gave permission to take a risk and to write something that is honestly like resistant to the workshop setting. Yeah. Can you imagine if Gertrude Stein was in your workshop and like brought a rose is a rose is a rose to the room?
So context. A rose is a rose is a rose, if you hear that, is big Gertrude Stein's famous line. So when you see it on memes and stuff like that, it's ripped from her writing. Mm-hmm.
And so, like, try to imagine a room full of people, like, if they get that poem, what are they going to say about it?
It's
like,
true.
This is true. This is a problematic image. Like,
so I see that you're writing about the rose.
Yeah, exactly.
Why do you say rose 3 times?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's workshop. That's an MFA workshop. That's what it is. So anyway, it was my first time writing a poem that resisted the workshop reading strategy.
Yeah.
And so all that is to say, once I finally graduated, and I had no workshop to write for, I wrote nothing but poems that resist the workshop reading mentality.
My manuscript is mostly poems that were explicitly rejected by my MFA workshop setting. Yeah. And I think they're the better poems, actually. So it's productive in that sense. We were also discussing, before I started recording, though you'll get an outtake later, I oftentimes record Patrick without him knowing. But this was not what we recorded, about how the gay poets talk about couches.
Yeah.
And shoes. Because for the poem that Patrick will share is like a ekphrastic piece. Mm-hmm. Can you explain what ekphrasis means for our listeners and viewers?
So an ekphrastic poem is a poem that responds to a work of visual art, and it comes from the Greek word ekphrasis, which means description. So long history, beginning with Homer describing Achilles' shield in the early epics. And it's now sort of evolved into its own poetic form. Any poem that is responding to, describing, engaging with a work of visual art. Mm-hmm.
And actually, it's my favorite prompt that I give undergrads. Actually, if I don't have anything I care about them otherwise working on, or if they seem stuck on writing, is just to go to the Henry Art Gallery on the UW campus because it's free, or like whatever other galleries near them if we're in Bothell, and practice ekphrasis poetry. Yeah. And that was my personal prompt to myself when I lived in Portland.
And I think it does so much good work because it takes the pressure off of that profound thought that I think I need to.
I think you can safely say we all.
Yeah,
Having
we
been
all
teaching poetry, and I'm sure many of you might guess, when you have like people learning poetry, the impulse people have is I have to be profound. And actually, I'm interrupting you because this is perfect segue, because one of the reasons we're doing this vlog is I want to emphasize how poetry is not that at its best.
Yeah.
Actually, and that's where it intersects usefully with like music and pop culture and sound studies.
Yeah.
I'm going to sidebar because I want to make sure we get to it. You said you do libretto studies. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. So a libretto is the words that are set to music in a piece of classical music. So they're most often heard in operas. So the plural is libretti. I find it horribly pretentious, so I tend to switch between librettos and libretti. Yeah, it's very, I sort of read the room, and I'm like, is this a librettos or a libretti kind of audience? But yeah, so when you go to the opera, and usually they're singing in Italian, that's why it's an Italian word. The words that they're singing is the libretto.
Okay, that's helpful. And then I'm going to put pressure on you in a way that you can totally reject.
Okay.
But I also happen to know that you like pop music too.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit about how, like, you obviously have this, like, deep understanding and knowledge of what's considered very classical knowledge in terms of, like, music and poetry. How do you see that, like, informing or involving your interest in pop culture poetry? Or pop culture poetry, pop music, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so
and can you give an example?
I absolutely adore pop music.
Yeah.
And I have this, like, really intense sort of, like, analytic approach to it, which is, like, kind of
so does
disgusting.
my partner, too. So that's why it's, like, fascinating to me.
And what I think is so interesting about it is sort of, like, all of these elements rendered down to their most sort of, like, basic form.
What do you mean by that?
So
just real condescending.
Like when we're talking, it does sound real condescending, doesn't it? It's just like, it's super simple. Don't you get it?
Basic.
It's really basic. No, so like if you're taking a libretto, let's say you're taking your Mozart, and you're taking a Lorenzo da Ponte libretto, which he wrote the libretti. See, it's Italian, so you have to say libretti. You have to say libretti. No, but so you're taking the text for Don Giovanni.
Yeah.
You know, like suddenly you have this complex story, which is this sort of like Don Juan story with all of these like intense social commentaries going on and these intense sort of characterizations of these humans and these characters that are engaged in like a very human drama.
Yeah.
And then you have to set it to music that is sonically interesting, and it has to go on for 2 or 3 hours. So like when you're making an opera, you have a great big story with all these people and all these motivations. The music has to engage with like, who are these people? What does the music of this character sound like? Not only that, but like their quality of speech, because we all speak with, we all have a certain cadence, we all have certain words that we use, or a cadence, if you will.
Cadence is the right pronunciation. Patrick was the one who formally informed me. No, it really is cadence.
And so you have to find the melody that fits the arc of the sentence.
Yeah.
You know, when you say a sentence, it does have a kind of shape to it. The sentence that I just did had like a really exaggerated shape. Like the word shape went really far up there, and so if I were to set that to music, the note would have to go up there as well.
I see.
And it would have to be a rhythm that followed and that made sense with the sort of meter and rhythm of the speech.
Meter being
like the pattern of stress and unstress in how we talk. Some syllables, syllable. The emphasis is on the first syllable of syllable.
Syllable,
yeah. So following the pattern of stress and unstress.
Yeah.
The music has to match that. And when you're dealing with Italian, when you're dealing with an opera, you're dealing with classical music, it's very complex.
Yeah.
It's very difficult. It's difficult to compose, I can imagine, but it's also difficult to hear, especially if you don't speak Italian, and especially if you aren't, you have 2 levels of fluency going on there. You have fluency in Italian and like how Italian sounds, and then you have fluency in how music is written and how music works. So if you don't understand how musical rhythm matches spoken rhythm, like there's something you don't quite have access to.
Yeah.
But now we're getting to pop music. When it's pop music, the melodies...
It's basic.
And the rhythms are basic. You know, it's always 4/4 time. Especially nowadays, you have that, like, the bass drum is always pounding on every downbeat. You have, it's called 4 on the Floor, comes from, like, disco and house music, and now it shows up in, like, all of our songs. Like, so I'm going to talk about Teenage Dream by Katy Perry. So, like...
I hate Katy Perry.
Yeah, like...
Sorry, internet world.
No, it's totally fine.
She drives me nuts.
But, and I have terrible pitch, so you're going to have to forgive me. I'm going to try not to, like, sing too much. But you have this beat, and when she does the original chorus, let me find it. So it's like, you make me feel like I'm living a teenage dream. And you can hear it when she says teenage dream. It's when the hand is up. So it's going teenage dream. It's syncopated. But when she gets to the bridge, let you put your hands on me in my skin-tight jeans, be my teenage dream tonight. Oh. So suddenly in the bridge, teenage dream isn't on the offbeat, it's on the downbeat. Yeah. And so it really just, like, she's flipped it ever so slightly. She's just sort of scooted it up, that half beat. And even though she's saying the same words, and the melody really isn't that different, because she's made just like this tiny change to line up the rhythm of the speech with the rhythm of the drum beat.
Which is part of what makes it so catchy.
Yes. And that's like, it just is like, it is in your head. And
it's in your body.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And whether you like it or not, like, you are stuck with it.
Certainly stuck in my head now.
Yeah. see, there it is. So, and all it took was like me clapping and singing off pitch, and now we're all just like. So it's amazing that she can do. I won't say she, because I'm sure she has like a whole team of songwriters that are like focus grouping the living daylights out of this pop song. But so that's what I mean when I'm like the most basic elements. They're taking the words teenage dream and these basic elements of the downbeat and the upbeat. And they're doing it one way and then they're doing it another way. And because they do it those two different ways, it makes the bridge, when she's, suddenly, be your teenage dream tonight, it becomes like, it's so memorable and so important, and it's kind of amazing. Yeah.
And it's compressed, as opposed to watching like a 2-hour opera.
Exactly.
So pop music fits then into this need and desire for this like compressed version that you can hook into. Yeah. Which also helps it stick in your head, which is actually the origin of poetry, right? Like rhyme and rhythm were actually invented or used for memorization, for passing stories and songs and so forth down. Totally. Right? Because it's what your body remembers. Yeah.
And so,
cool. And it also creates tension. Because if you have these two kind of opposite movements happening, it's that tension or friction in a seemingly simple movement that also hooks you in, which, if you watch the other episodes, it like hooks into that. If you're talking about it in a comedy, like Hannah Gadsby creating and releasing tension, how you have to do that in a good poem. A good poem has tension, and so forth.
Yeah, so it becomes a sort of, tension is the best word for it. You have those where you want to place the stress. You want to place it on teenage dream, right? But she's giving it to you on teenage dream,
which is irritating.
Yeah. If not irritating, subtly off. Like, no, put it on the beat, and then she does, and that's another reason I go to pop music is that it doesn't pull any punches. Like, you want her
boxing metaphors again. This is great.
But you want her to do it, and then she does it. Yeah. And, like, that's another reason I go to pop music. It's like, there's no, like, I'm not going to keep it tense.
No fucking with you.
Yeah. It's like, you would like this on the downbeat, wouldn't you? Well, here you go. You only had to wait 2.5 minutes.
It's kind of like, you want the Jolly Rancher, not the carrot. I'm just going to give it to you. Yeah.
So,
perfect.
Therein lies the love for pop music.
God, we're at 19 minutes. All right. So, we're supposed to be 10 to 20 minutes. I really want you to hear Patrick read Patrick's poems. Patrick, we're not going to talk about Veronica Forrest Thompson today, because I really want to stick it to your work. But
I was so prepared to talk about her, read her.
How about we're going to do a second episode.
We'll do a second episode.
And we'll do it right after this, and I'll post it way later.
I love the idea that Veronica Forrest Thompson was kicked out by Katy Perry. completely inadvertently.
Which is
We sat down, we switched the computer on, and I'm like, let me hold forth. And then I'm like, well, let me sing Katy Perry to you.
Which is like the dream, FYI. Like, don't get me wrong, you can whack. We're going to do an episode 2 on Veronica Forrest Thompson, because I do not wish to shut you down.
Okay.
But I really want people to hear Patrick's poetry.
Okay.
And as a heads up, the reason we're going to do a follow-up episode is one of the new plans, which you can check out via the recent update, is that we're going to do follow-ups with the people that I interview who are willing every 6 months to a year. And then whenever you have updates, like you got a publication or something happened, I'll post it in the Facebook group and other places. So people keeping up with your story are like, cool, Patrick.
Cool. Okay.
Way to go, dude.
Okay.
All right, your poems while we're at 20 minutes. I'm going to read the poem, and then Patrick's going to read the poem.
Okay.
And then we're going to stop. And then we're going to start our second episode, which I'll post another time. And you'll hear more of the discussion on it.
Okay.
We're going to do this.
Should I change my shirt so it looks like a totally different...
I mean,
1 year later, I'll change my hair.
Yours isn't going to be 1 year later. I might actually post both in the same week. Legit. All right. So, poem. This is from Patrick's manuscript, which I want to say is gorgeous. I really love the fact that your background in sound studies comes out in your poetry. And I've actually also had the privilege of hearing Patrick read. And one of the reasons I asked Patrick, I think you're the first person I asked, actually, was I was like, I know Patrick knows how to read. Because poetry readings are boring, oftentimes. Not all the time, but...
Could we read... Maybe you can edit this out.
Yeah.
But could we read different poems? Because these poems I picked because I think they'd go really well with Veronica
let's do
here.
it.
But let's do the poems that you heard me read the other night at that reading.
Yep.
I think might be more in line. Should I send those to you? Should I cue them up on my phone?
Cue them up on your phone so we can move quick.
Done.
I mean, what poet doesn't have their poems on their phone ready to go?
Right.
Ever.
Google Drive. It's like...
Yeah, my students were like, Chelsea, read your poems. And I was like, I don't want to. But really, I just didn't have them on me. / didn't want to.
Okay. We'll do... Do we want to do this one? Or... Yeah, I might as well just do the first one.
All right. This will just be a 2-part vlog because we're jamming.
Yeah.
This is the poetry version.
This will go, and it'll go through to here.
To because?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sorry, the phone vibrated. I was like, it speaks. And the title of the poem is Reverberation, so it was really intense. All right, Reverberations. Therefore, you want to know if the city is as fragile as any other nowhere. Therefore, a stitch of black yogurt covers the city's opening. A voice can be a theory of sound, and a voice can describe a theory of sound, and the sound of a voice can describe a space with its own radiant features, qualities, architecture, rapture, and capture. One slid out of a horse, and while still vaguely electric with birth, was slid into one of the city's nights. Offspring can be a theory of time. When this began, it was because you sustained the voice's sound on one side of your head before the other. Therefore, the difference became a distance in your mind. Therefore, the space in your mind became a place light could be. Therefore, there is the story that the voice tells, and then there is the condition of the city that the voice describes, not in its language, but in its resonance. Please echoes louder than. Only when electricity meets resistance does it become incandescent, but that is another theory altogether. Altogether, the blue mice drag their tails through the rooms. One connects to another and another as if by their syntax. They want to know if this city is a syntax. It is not, it is agrammatical, and that is a derangement only if you can't hear it. Please echoes louder than because. Right. And I will say, it's really hard to read without the line breaks. So we'll talk about that maybe in our follow-up episode. But I was like, damn, I don't know where these lines would normally break.
Well, they're all...
So I had a harder time, like...
Yeah, they're all sentences. So it's all prose in a way.
That's helpful to know, because I was like, fuck, I'm fucking it up.
Yeah, but it's been narrowed down on the phone.
Okay.
But ultimately, any of these breaks are just arbitrary. It's supposed to go on to the end.
Got it.
So...
That's helpful.
So that's a tough act to follow. But
not true.
So this is
all right. Prepare yourselves.
This is the first section of Reverberations. Therefore, you want to know if the city is as fragile as any other nowhere. Therefore, a stitch of black yogurt covers the city's opening. A voice can be a theory of sound, and a voice can describe a theory of sound, and the sound of a voice can describe a space with its own radiant features, qualities, architecture. Rapture and capture. One slid out of a horse, and while still vaguely electric with birth, was slid into one of the city's nights. Offspring can be a theory of time. When this began, it was because you sustained the voice's sound on one side of your head before the other. Therefore, the difference became a distance in your mind. Therefore, the space in your mind became a place light could be. Therefore, there is the story that the voice tells, and then there is the condition of the city that the voice describes, not in its language, but in its resonance. Please echoes louder than. Only when electricity meets resistance does it become incandescent, but that is another theory altogether. All together, the blue mice drag their tails through the rooms, one connects to another and another as if by their syntax. They want to know if this city is a syntax. It is not. It is agrammatical, and that is a derangement only if you can't hear it. Please echoes louder than because.
Whew. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I went so over and betrayed all y'all's trust in my brevity, but Patrick, we're going to have a follow-up episode. Don't worry. We are good friends. We hang out. But thank you for sharing your poems.
Thank
also, if you're down for it, would you be willing to be some of the flash brief readings, the 2-minute or less of reading, and we'll include some of your poems that way too.
Totally. Yeah.
All right. As you know, if you have any requests, comments, suggestions, or want to be featured, you don't have to have a book published. I'm over that structure. Send me a message. You have my website, Twitter, with just Chelsea Grimmer as the handle, Instagram with an underscore between Chelsea and Grimmer, the Facebook page, and my email, cgrimmer@uw.edu, because I'm learning that people are picky about their platforms. All right. Thank you so much, and be sure to tune in more for later for more. I'm feeling goofy. All right. Bye, y'all.
Bye.